Nigel Farage, who's honorary president of Reform UK, called it a joke. But some might say the idea from the Conservatives might appeal to Reform's natural supporters. Let's speak to Frederick Chedham, Reform's defence spokesperson, who also was a colonel in the British Army. Fred, this is Norway do this, Switzerland, Sweden, Denmark, France. Maybe the Conservatives are onto something.
Thank you for having me, Rosie. At first glance, it's a superficially attractive idea, which could appeal to some, but it's unworkable. You mentioned, let me go through the reasons. You mentioned Norway, Denmark, Sweden. All of these countries are countries with histories of militia, citizenship armies. They're not deployable in the way the British Army is. The British Army is designed to be able to be globally projected with the Navy and the Royal Air Force. So unlike countries which are designed for territorial defence and therefore the training burden is small, our training burden is extremely high. That's one reason.
But this is about giving young people a sort of sense of national identity and pride, isn't it? And, if we look at recruitment levels currently right now for the army, where you have much experience, this might be something that would galvanise young people to say, actually, this is something I really want to support.
Well, in which case, then let's put the money, 2.5 billion, into proper recruiting, retention and keeping the professionals that we have, rather than losing them at the rate of goodness knows what. I mean, morale in the armed forces is low. The armed forces Continuous Attitude Survey has just announced that 6 out of 10 service personnel report their morale as low. That's tragic. It was never like that when I was serving. And it's all because the Conservatives and previous governments have hollowed out our defences. Now, in terms of the young people, I hear a lot of Conservative politicians telling me how good it is for young people and what it's going to do for them. What no one's telling me is what it's actually going to do for the military, because it brings no military value to our capability. On the contrary, all it will do is give us some 30,000 people, which we have to train. We have to find a training estate for, which we have to try an infrastructure for which we don't have instructors. And presumably they've got to be paid, fed, clothed, housed, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, I'm afraid this is a bit of a policy that's been thrown at a wall to see if it will stick. And it's changing by the hour, of course, as we expect.
And, well, it's the Conservatives potentially trying to chip away at who they think might be voting for your party. Tell us, what would be deemed a success for Reform when it comes to the election in, just over 5 weeks' time? What's the sort of goal for the election? Do you have any kind of target for how many seats you want to secure?
Well, I think that would be slightly premature at this stage, to be honest. This is a new party.
But you must be ambitious. I mean, what are you aiming for? What would be success?
Rosie, I didn't say anything about lacking ambition. What I'm saying is that there is no track record, there is no data, there's nothing really to go on. I mean, we have a number of ideas as to which target seats we believe that we have a great feeling. But you will see, I think, that every time that we stand anywhere, we get a great deal of interest. And this is because our policies are conservative. They are traditionally conservative in a way that the current Conservative Party has lost its way. Now, how much that translates into, we don't know. But I'll say one thing, is this is a party which is not defined by this general election. It isn't a one-stop party. It's here for a long haul. And parties take time to grow. They have to build organizations. They have to find their roots. They have to establish their power bases. You cannot do that on the time frame of a general election that's been called in a snap way by the Tories.
Yeah, I wonder if that's a sort of quite heavy management of expectations from you to us about how you think you might perform, and a hint really that maybe you're not quite ready. I mean, you've pledged to stand a full slate of candidates. You've got until the end of next week to do that. How many candidates do you still need to find?
As I understand it, the party candidate list is complete. There may be onesies and twosies here and people's plans change at the last moment. But in terms of the number of candidates, we will be contesting all of the seats available, as Richard has said before.
OK, so bar one or two seats, you've got a full complement now.
Yes.
OK. How confident are you in all of those candidates? Because, as many as 110 seats, this was the campaigning organisation Hope Not Hate found, as many as 110 of those seats had to be dropped or swapped since January because you hadn't done the vetting right.
I think that's a little unfair. I mean, every party has candidates who fail the test, and so obviously some of them try to hide it, some of them put it to one side, some hope it won't come up, some of it is stuff that they do. I mean, I'm going to put our record of what we've got. If you look at what some of the accusations that that organisation, Hope Not Hate, levelled, it was because they didn't like the people. It wasn't necessarily just because of what they had done. And if we want to compare track records on sleaze, general suitability, failure, well, let's just look at both the Labour and the Conservative Party, because they've got, how many MPs is it that have been suspended from Parliament between those two organisations? Some of whom we don't even know why they've been suspended. So I don't think we're going to take lectures from Hope Not Hate.
But I mean, lectures from Richard Tice to the candidates was things like, for heaven's sake, if you're going to have a glass on Friday night, then don't use social media.
Well, I didn't receive that particular advice myself, so I can't comment on that. But I mean, like anything, we expect our candidates, they have a great deal of freedom. They are normal people that are in society. They reflect society, so that they won't all be the same Tory identikit drones which fill our green benches every week. They will be people who look at real life from a real life perspective.
I mean, surely you're not defending the actions of the people who've then since decided shouldn't stand as a candidate.
No, of course not. Who would? But of course, it depends on the reasons what they were. I mean, some of the candidate abuse that was levelled at them for trivial, past, or incorrect and misinformed events was considerable. So I think, yes, of course, there are always lessons to be learnt by vetting, but those lessons are learnt by the other parties just as much as they're learnt by us.
Fred, thank you very much for speaking to us. Frederick Chedham, Reform's defence spokesperson, who was also a colonel in the British Army, who also clearly agrees with Nigel Farage, Honorary President of Reform UK, that the Conservatives' plan for national service is a joke.
Well, we've just been hearing from Sir Keir Starmer and about some of the things which are being said about him by the Conservatives. But of course, this election is not just about the Conservatives and Labour. There are lots of other parties who are standing, and their vote shares will make a difference to who enters the next government. Let's talk a little bit about them with Kieran Pedley, who is from the pollsters Ipsos. Kieran, good morning.
Good morning, Adam.
Before we get on to the little parties, just want to ask you about national service. Do we have any idea whether this is something which hits the spot with the voters?
So I think on national service, it's one of those questions that it does depend a little bit on how you frame it. We've actually got an article out from earlier this year using the Sir Humphrey questions from Yes Minister to sort of show that. But I think on a more serious note, you will get more people, you typically get more people support than oppose the idea. And I think it is popular amongst some of the target voters Rishi Sunak might have in mind in this campaign, such as some of those 2019 Conservative voters that have defected to Reform. The big question, though, I think, with any polling question isn't just whether there's support for it, but actually if it's going to move the dial. So with those sort of Conservative to Reform switchers, we know the big issue for them is immigration. So unless the Conservatives have a convincing offer on that during this campaign, maybe national service won't quite cover it.
But would you see national service as being something targeted at the voters which perhaps the Conservatives are worried about losing, both to Labour and also perhaps more particularly to Reform?
I think so. And again, this isn't the top issue for those voters either, but I think it definitely is something that appeals to sort of older, small C Conservative voters. It's not something that, dare I say, young people are crying out for. So I think that's if you think of there being two core switching groups the Conservatives will be worried about, one would be those switching directly to Labour, because in many cases they count twice, don't they? It's one off your column and one on the Labour column. There's also, like I say, these switches to Reform that are very unhappy about immigration, culturally conservative, less likely to be graduates. Really the core of the Brexit coalition that delivered Boris Johnson his majority in 2019. So I suspect that's where this policy is aimed at. With Nigel Farage not standing, maybe they think they can hoover up some of those votes quickly and narrow the polls a bit in the first week of the campaign. But let's see.
Now, you mentioned Nigel Farage. I mean, to what extent is this a two-horse race, a general election, really, between Labour and the Conservatives? And to what extent do other parties matter?
So other parties always matter. I think this is every election we have this discussion, don't we? And I think that it is important to recognise that it's quite common in a general election campaign for the smaller parties to get squeezed as you get towards polling day, simply because voters start to pay attention to who might be the prime minister, who's going to lead the government. So let's take the Greens very briefly, for example. In 2019, we had the Greens on 8% in the summer, but they ended up polling at 3% in the general election because they got squeezed as polling day got closer. So it's reasonable to think that could happen to not just Reform, but to the Greens and maybe even Liberal Democrats to an extent in this election too.
And it does seem that Israel-Gaza is a real motivator for people on the left to perhaps think that they're not going to vote for Labour. We've had the local elections. I mean, how many constituencies do you think in reality, particularly those with a significant Muslim population, could Labour be up for losing?
Well, I'm sort of reluctant to put a number on it because each constituency has its own very sort of unique characteristics and different numbers of, let's say Muslim voters or disaffected left-wing voters within them. I think there's definitely, I would say, sort of something in the region of half a dozen or so where Labour might be nervous. I think, but the point I would make is that this is somewhat of a slow burn issue, I think, politically in the UK. At the moment, in this general election, in this 6 weeks, Labour's poll lead is very, very large, around sort of 20 points on average. So it's unlikely to be something that's decisive, this idea of Labour leaking votes to the Greens or smaller parties at this stage. But British politics is more than just about one election. So it could be a long-term trend that we see. Just on the Greens very briefly, when we ask about the issues that will impact your vote, the overwhelming issue, as you'd expect, would be the environment, followed by then the NHS. But around 1 in 5 Green voters do tell us that foreign affairs is one of the top issues that will impact their vote. So I think under the radar, there is clearly a sort of, if you like, Gaza effect there. But we'll have to wait and see what the long-term impact of that is.
But we shouldn't overdo it. What about the Liberal Democrats? Because I remember a previous election, a Liberal Democrat campaigner, someone in their headquarters saying to me, look, Adam, the simple truth is when Labour does well, the Lib Dems do well as well.
Yeah, so what's interesting at the moment is their national vote share in opinion polls hasn't really moved since the last general election. I mean, it'd be interesting to see whether that does actually happen in the campaign. But there have been campaigns in the past where the Liberal Democrats have gained during them. It's a bit more mixed in recent times. But again, as we know with the Liberal Democrats, it's not always about their national vote share. It's about how effectively they can target their seats. And under our first past the post electoral system, the ability to target effectively is very important. And the Liberal Democrats do that well. So they'll be looking at so-called blue wall seats in the south of England. They'll be looking at areas of the south coast, such as Lewis or different areas of Surrey, and trying to sort of pick off some conservative Liberal Democrat marginals at this election. So they may well expect to gain seats, even if actually vote share wise, they're not that much better off than they were in 2019.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting since we just saw Keir Starmer speaking on the South Coast there, that a lot of constituencies held by the Conservatives at the moment, but some of them, the Lib Dems appear to be the challenger. Others, it looks like Labour.
Yeah, I think part of that is just about local conditions. We can't forget that obviously general elections are in many ways, 650 or so, or a fewer than that this time, individual contests. So all politics is local at the end of the day. And there are some seats where there's a strong Liberal Democrat presence in the council, let's say, or a tradition where the Liberal Democrats have done better than Labour, and therefore they become the primary challengers. I think actually the heart of the premise of your question maybe is biggest problem the Conservatives face at this election, which is there is this quite large anti-Conservative coalition that in many respects is prepared to vote tactically for whoever it is that will remove the Conservatives from power. We saw that in the local elections, didn't we? A real efficient vote as an anti-Conservative vote. That has to be the nightmare scenario for the Conservatives going into this election. And of course, we haven't spoken about Scotland, which I think, I've got an article out today on this question, that could be a very decisive aspect of this election too.
All right, well, just quickly on Scotland, looking good for Labour and not so good for the SNP, is that right?
Yeah, I think so. And I think when obviously the election being called last week was a surprise to a lot of people. I think one of the potential miscalculations the Conservatives might have made is around Scotland. Going long into October may have given John Swinney time to sort of steady the ship with the SNP, but the sense is that this has come at the worst possible time for them and probably the best possible time for Labour.